Welcome to The Plain Truth. I'm your host, Plain, and each week we try to get into one of the mysteries, anomalies, or the dirty underbelly of the world around us. This week we have a special guest, Mack White, who is an interesting character, cartoonist and writer in the parapolitical scene, conspiracies, mysteries, and some of those strange things that come from Texas. Mack, are you there?
I am right here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I appreciate it. Glad you could come. And along for the ride are a couple of my friends. Daddy Bob, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. How you doing?
Good, good. And Lenny.
I am right here.
Okay, well, let's get going. So, Mack, I guess we can start. You're not totally a household name yet. I mean, still got a few years to work on that, right? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I started out as an underground cartoonist. I began doing comics in the 80s, in the era of the new wave underground mini comics movement, and then began to start publishing professionally. I've published a few books with Fantagraphics, the big cartoonist publisher here based in Seattle. My first book was the first comic book was The Mutant Book of the Dead, and after that a 3-issue miniseries called The Villa of the Mysteries, and my work has appeared in numerous anthologies, Snake Eyes, Buzz, a bunch of them, different magazines, Details Magazine, True West, a whole bunch of them. More recently, in the relatively new Fantagraphics anthology Hotwire. There have been 3 volumes of that published over the past several years. And then back several years ago in 2004, I co-edited with Gary Groff, the publisher of Fantagraphics, an anthology that was you could call it a graphic novel, except it was all true because it was the true story of the Bush family. We were doing this during the second election that reelected George W. Bush. And I co-edited that as well as contributed a chapter to it. And we had 25 cartoonists from around the world who contributed different chapters. And what that book was, I put together an outline, which was the full history of the Bush crime family, starting with Prescott Bush, who was Hitler's banker in America, and right up to the present day, which that would have been 2004. And everyone contributed a different chapter. And since then, I've done other things. I am currently collaborating with the Western novelist Mike Kirby here in Texas on a series of graphic novels about Texas history. It's called Texas Tales Illustrated. Our first volume came out 2 years ago. That covered the Texas Revolution, the Alamo, the Battle of San Jacinto, and so forth. We won the Will Rogers Award for juvenile publications in just the summer before last, because this book is intended for use in schools. Texas history is a required subject here in the 7th grade in the state of Texas. And we're currently wrapping up the second book, which covers the Trail Drives era. And in addition to that, there's my activities in the research community, the conspiracy or parapolitical conspiracy research community. I've been co-hosting with Smiles Lewis on the Anomaly Radio Network, our show PSYOP Radio. And I also do my own podcast, The Mack White Show, and just various radio activities and all sorts of, nefarious activities, I guess you could say, that brings us pretty much up to the present date.
Sorry about that. You're in a very nefarious place there in
yes.
Austin.
Absolutely. This is the belly of the beast in certain ways.
Well, maybe we could start dealing with some of them. In this show, we tend to get more into the conspiratorial side of things, or I guess you'd say the fringe, kind of. So one of the real topics that we could get into today is Johnson. There's a new book out about him, right? Is that what you were referring to there the other day?
Yes, there's a new book. It's by Roger Stone, who is a legendary political operative. He worked for Richard Nixon and other questionable characters. But Roger has a lot of inside knowledge that he got over the years from Nixon and from other sources. And his most recent book, which came out just before the 50th JFK anniversary a couple of months ago, is called The Man Who Killed Kennedy. And it gets into the role, and it was a big one, that Lyndon Johnson, the vice president under Kennedy, played in the assassination. This isn't new. As far as, it's been suggested and wondered about for years. In fact, I can remember just one of the first things I heard people saying right after the assassination here in Texas was, well, I'll bet old Lyndon had something to do with that, because at the time that the Kennedy assassination occurred, there were scandals breaking in Washington that all tended to focus on Lyndon Johnson. And that was the Billy Saul Estes scandal and the Bobby Baker scandal. Bobby Baker was a protege of Lyndon Johnson's, and they were involved in all sorts of criminal activity by which Johnson was enriching himself. And in the course of trying to cover up these crimes that were being investigated, there were some murders committed. And they wouldn't have been the first murders that Lyndon Johnson was involved with. And this investigation was happening in '63 because the Kennedys wanted to be rid of Lyndon Johnson. They never wanted him on the ticket to begin with. And the only reason that Lyndon Johnson was, on the 1960 ticket as vice president was because the Kennedys had been blackmailed by Johnson. And this information comes not only from this book I'm talking about, Roger Stone's book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, but also even JFK's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, said the same thing, that what it came down to was that John F. Kennedy's womanizing left him very open to blackmail. And of course, it's well known, I believe, that the Kennedys, one of their worst enemies was J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, who had an enormous file on everyone, all of it for the use of blackmail, and had had his eye on the Kennedys for a long time. And John F. Kennedy's womanizing left him vulnerable to blackmail. And so that is what was used by Lyndon Johnson to get himself on the presidential ticket that year. Now, Johnson it wasn't that he aspired to vice president. It came down to this, that the people whom Lyndon Johnson represented, and let's just call it by its best known name, the military industrial complex, big oil and so forth, and here in Austin, the Brown and Root Company, which they were the first ones that bankrolled Lyndon Johnson's political career, they were concerned by the possibility of a Kennedy presidency. And so they were maneuvering to put Lyndon Johnson in place as vice president to perhaps control them. But they proved to be uncontrollable. The Kennedys, that would be John F. Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. So as time went on, they realized that they had a serious enemy in their midst, Lyndon Johnson. And they wanted to drop him from the '64 ticket. So behind the scenes, Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General, was pushing for these investigations into all of Lyndon Johnson's many criminal activities. And on the day of the assassination, November 22nd, 1963, there was testimony in Congress with a key witness to all of the Bobby Baker scandal and criminal activity. It was happening that day, and this individual pointed the finger at Lyndon Johnson as the kingpin for this entire thing, that, murder incorporated, you might say. And this was happening in Washington, D.C., while the motorcade was moving through Dallas. And also, Life magazine was ready to go to press the very next week with a major expose on Lyndon Johnson. What this would have done, had Kennedy not been killed that day, it would have been the end of Lyndon Johnson's career. He would have faced prosecution. He certainly would have not had a career anymore. He would have ended up in prison. And all of those individuals that he represented, all of these entities in the military-industrial complex, Big Oil, for instance, which got John F. Kennedy was about to get rid of the oil depletion allowance, which was nothing more than a very nice, lucrative tax dodge for the oil companies. And that was just one of many things. He was trying to get rid of the CIA. He had sworn that he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces after the Bay of Pigs, where he felt he had been misled. And he fired Allen Dulles and all of these individuals. Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, the oil barons of Texas, Clint Murchison Jr., H.L. Hunt, and so many other individuals who were also looking forward to the possibility of making a lot of money in Vietnam. All of them stood to lose so much if Lyndon went down. And Lyndon stood to lose a great deal personally. So Lyndon Johnson was the pivotal figure, you might say. You can't really say that it was just a Lyndon Johnson plot, because there were all these other parties involved. Oh, and including the mafia. Another crony of Lyndon Johnson's was the New Orleans mob boss, Carlos Marcello, and so many others, the Cuban exiles, individuals in the CIA, all of them who had felt betrayed by what happened at the Bay of Pigs. So there were so many who stood to lose if Kennedy not only finished his term, but got reelected. But, well, needless to say, he was shot in Dallas, and the testimony that was being given that day in Congress and the Life magazine article, all of that disappeared as a new regime, a new form of government. As Jack Ruby himself put it, a new form of government came to play.
Yes, well, listening to that, I'm reminded of what you just said. I'm reminded of that old quote about treason doth never prosper. What is the reason for if it doth prosper? None dare call it treason.
Absolutely.
So it was a coup d'etat, essentially. Now, I mean, obviously the groups behind it were already powerful, right? It wasn't like they were totally out of the loop, but it was just a power struggle.
Yes, the Kennedys were going up against a very, very powerful group of individuals. And, it's amazing that they were as successful as they were. And really, had anything gone wrong in Dallas, and, that could have easily happened, well, then history would have been very different. So much depended on their success that day in Dallas. There had been 2 previous attempts to stage an assassination in the months leading up to Dallas. There was first an attempt in Miami. Well, it was uncovered, and it was the same kind of plot. They were going to, place shooters in tall buildings as Kennedy was brought in by motorcade through Miami. And they also had a patsy lined up that it was going to be pinned on. Well, that plot was discovered. And so that one was called off. They decided to bring Kennedy into Miami by helicopter instead of motorcade. Then there was another one. These are both well documented. There was an attempt to stage an assassination in Chicago. That didn't come off for various reasons. Well, their last chance, their last hope of succeeding, and they had to succeed because they were running out of time, was in Dallas. And Dallas really was perfect because of the control that individuals such as Lyndon Johnson had over
Well, the mayor of Dallas.
the mayor, Earl Cabell, who was the brother of Charles Cabell, who was a highly placed CIA official who was fired by Kennedy. He was the fellow who arranged the motorcade route. And of course, Dallas was the home of the big oil barons, Clint Murchison, H.L. Hunt, and they, of course, were cronies along with Johnson, with Carlos Marcello. Over in New Orleans, well, Dallas was in Marcello's territory. And it was really perfect. It was the only place, perhaps, in the United States where the plot could have finally succeeded. But they weren't taking any chances, I'll tell you. They had shooters all over Dealey Plaza. And, but, had anyone missed at a crucial moment, then again, history would have been entirely different. The last 50 years of history would be something else entirely.
I have a question. This is Lenny. Mack, didn't they have a gun or a firearm in the car that Kennedy was riding in?
Well, I've heard different things about that. Nothing is really proven conclusively. There have been theories, speculation that perhaps one of the Secret Service men in the front seat, the driver, or the one sitting beside him, might have turned and shot Kennedy. I don't know if that's so. Most researchers discount that, and there are documentaries that can be seen on YouTube and so forth that supposedly show some movement on the part of the driver that might have been a gun in his hand. On the other hand, it may simply have been the microphone in his hand. So we just don't know. But one thing is for certain, that the Zapruder film and other films, home movies that were made of the shooting, show very clearly that nothing went according to the usual Secret Service protocol. And the car, instead of speeding off at the first sound of shots, slowed down almost to a stop. And there was a major, let's call it kindly, a failure on the part of the Secret Service that day. The only one who seems to have had any energy to do anything about it was Clint Hill, who jumped off the car and ran up to the presidential limousine and got Jackie back into the car. So many things. I mean, it's a fact, really, I believe. I think it's established that John F. Kennedy's security stood down that day. And that doesn't mean that every Secret Service agent was in on it necessarily. There's an interesting moment in a clip that can be seen widely all over the internet where you see as the motorcade starts to leave Love Field to begin its journey down through downtown Dallas and so forth, you see something very strange occur. It was the accepted practice, it was, necessary that there should always be two Secret Service agents riding on the bumper of the presidential limousine. But what you see very clearly happening in this video that was taken by Channel 8 WFAA in Dallas that day, clear video is someone on the car behind. This would be one of the supervisors of the Secret Service agents motioning for those men to get off the presidential limousine. And you can't see the Secret Service agent on the left who jumps off the vehicle, but you can see very clearly the Secret Service agent who would have been riding on the Kennedy side of the limousine. He jumps off and he has this look of amazement in his face, and he's, throwing his hands in the air, in frustration and, just completely baffled. Why? What's going on here? Well, Kennedy was being stripped of his security at that moment, which is how a lot of major assassinations occur.
Mac, I think some people just don't appreciate how big the battle with Kennedy was. I'm originally from D.C., and so family and friends and all that are, all in the government game. And in my family, it was obvious that Johnson, was like, if not the key player, he was one of the 2 or 3 key players behind it. And even had a family friend in the Kennedy White House. And I don't know how to put it, but with so many key people in D.C. against them, they were going to have a tough time maintaining security, right? Because it wasn't like it was just Hoover and Johnson. It was far more than that.
Oh, yeah.
Like you said, it was the CIA, it was the military. You know what I mean? It was the military-industrial complex, all the contractors. And in fairness, I don't know if you want to call this fairness, but from the perspective of some people in D.C. or in these big businesses, the Kennedys were doing a lot of things that were very aggressive and they didn't like. And so just as an example, there had been a huge military contract that was coming up. And the military industrial complex there were two bidders. And I don't remember the names of them, but because all the companies have merged, McDonnell Douglas and all the others. And the military assumed that, let's just say, Consortium A was a far better deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was just more firepower and a lower cost and so on. And they knew that Kennedy might win, but they figured Nixon would win. But anyway, they were kind of lazy as the bureaucratic process dragged on, and Kennedy won. And then he and his brother thought about it and looked at it and said, if the other consortium won, we'd get more jobs in swing districts.
Mm-hmm.
And this would help us with our reelection. And so they essentially wanted to reopen the bidding and forced it to go the other way. And a lot of people in the military were very, very angry about that. But they couldn't say anything because, of course, he's the president. But I'm just trying to say the Kennedys weren't saints.
Oh, absolutely not.
And they had some very serious enemies. And some of those enemies would be willing to stand up in public, really, today and tell you why they were enemies, is all I'm trying to point out.
And one of their worst enemies was, of course, the so-called mafia. And that's an interesting thing because their own father, Joe Kennedy Sr., was a gangster himself. He was doing business with all of these guys, Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, and so forth. And in fact, the Kennedy would not have won had it not been for the help of the mafia. But what happens? They get into office, and suddenly Bobby Kennedy goes after the mafia like an attack dog. And that's a really interesting story. It's something that for years has puzzled people. How could that happen, And this is an area where I would really recommend Roger Stone's book because he presents a lot of information that has been available for some time. He brings it together in a very effective way, but he also has some new things to tell. But one important thing to remember here is that it came down to the personality of the Kennedy brothers. And it also was a matter of timing, because at some point early in Kennedy's of his term, Joe Kennedy Sr. has a stroke, and he's no longer able to control what his sons are doing. And that's very important, because up until that moment when he has that stroke, after which he's paralyzed, he can't talk, he can't do anything. Until that moment, he is fighting his son, Bobby Kennedy, all the way, telling him, my God, what's wrong with you? Why are you going after our friends in the mafia? And, well, it came down to a curious thing, that being Bobby Kennedy's personality, which was that when he was growing up, he was the one that all of the Kennedy family figured would grow up to become a priest. He was so devoutly religious. And he had this zealous aspect to his personality, the spiritual mission that was in complete contradiction to what his father was trying to do. And there is an interesting moment when there was a terrible argument that was witnessed, and I forget by whom, but it's described in the book I'm talking about, by one of the Kennedy family, a relative by marriage, an argument between Bobby Kennedy and his father, Joe Sr., where, I mean, it was just, raging out of control, furious. I mean, and after that, they weren't on speaking terms. And it was all over this issue that I'm talking about here, which was the Bobby Kennedy's determination to use his office and his influence on his brother, John Kennedy, to go after the mob and to try to clean up some of the corruption, which, of course, they had benefited from. Well, the thing about John F. Kennedy is that his persona was somewhat different. This was a guy who never really wanted to be in politics. He wasn't personally suited for it. He had some aspirations to be a writer, but really what he wanted to do was be a playboy. He wanted to party. But he was also very influenced by his brother, Bobby. And so, out of that dynamic came this interesting power struggle. And, the other thing about the Kennedys is, they're not saints at all, because as much as Bobby Kennedy had this spiritual mission that he was on, he was also very much his father's son. And his father, Joe Kennedy Sr., was always, having extramarital affairs with movie stars, Gloria Swanson, and so forth. And, well, that was just the lifestyle that his sons naturally followed. So Bobby Kennedy gets involved with Marilyn Monroe. And you still there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I heard a weird sound. So Bobby Kennedy gets involved with Marilyn Monroe, and that created more a vulnerability for not only himself but his brother. And you could get into
reckless.
Very reckless and foolhardy, and all of these things appear to have been, very much a part of their personality, and they could also be very Machiavellian. And ruthless. That's one word that's used over and over again with regard to Bobby Kennedy, how ruthless he was. So, it's a fascinating character study that I think historians will be trying to, interpret for years.
Oh, for sure. There's something funny about that, though, is there's a whole industry funded to attack the Kennedys. I mean, 50 years on, and we still have bogus books, and you know what I mean. It's ridiculous. They've spent tens or hundreds of millions in promoting all kinds of attacks on the Kennedys, and some of them were deserved, but a lot of them aren't. And I think it's kind of funny because to talk about the Kennedys as ruthless, I mean, compared to what, the oil guys and the military-industrial complex?
Yeah, absolutely.
You must
Or
be kidding me.
LBJ.
Or LBJ, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Ruthless.
Lyndon Johnson probably outdid everybody. And this is someone that Roger Stone, he quotes liberally from his former employer, Richard Nixon, who Nixon had this to say about Lyndon Johnson, that, you know, they had something in common that a lot of presidents do, which is a hunger for power and a willingness to do anything. But Nixon said privately that the big difference between himself and Lyndon was that Nixon didn't want to kill for it. But Lyndon Johnson had absolutely not one scruple. He is a character study that, my God, I don't know what kind of precedents you could find for it. I mean, a sociopath, a complete animal in many ways. And, you know, I wrote this article about Lyndon Johnson that I've had on my website for a number of years, and it's got a lot of readers over the years. I think more people have read this than have read anything I've ever done. And just to kind of quickly describe here, the article was the result of the fact that back when I first came to Austin as a student at the University of Texas in '77, the first job I got was working at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, transcribing oral history tapes, which was a job that I had to be even vetted by the FBI, unbelievably. Listen, I could never be approved by the FBI now. It could have only happened when I was 25. But because the interviews, oral history interviews that I was transcribing were politically sensitive. And they also revealed a lot about Lyndon Johnson's character. And so I was learning early on, but before these things began to be something that there were books being written about, I was up there on the top floor of the LBJ library here in Austin, learning a lot about Lyndon Johnson and learning it in an interesting atmosphere where, I would see people like Lady Bird Johnson on a regular basis there in the library, and people like Henry Kissinger would come in there, and I'm just this long-haired hippie kid, working at the, with the transcribing machine. And this picture of Lyndon Johnson is coming together in my mind. And so when I wrote this article, which I call the LBJ Robot, it's gotten a lot of readers and so forth, but I was very gratified that Roger Stone included 2 paragraphs from my article that basically sum up Lyndon Johnson's character. And that's in the chapter 1 of the book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy. And I'll just read this thing here because this is, my assessment, and it's the, summing up of Lyndon Johnson. And I'll just read from this. It says, I worked at the library for about a year. It was easy work and interesting. I would cue up the tapes on a reel-to-reel player, but put on a pair of headphones and working a foot pedal to rewind, pause, and fast-forward, transcribe interviews that had been conducted with people who had known Johnson at different times of his life. Most of the interviewees spoke glowingly of him. Even those who were critical of him, Kennedy staffers most notably, went to some pains to soften their criticism and try to find something nice to say. And yet, despite everyone's best efforts, what emerged from this Citizen Kane-style composite of interviews was not pretty. It was not said in so many words. In fact, it was left entirely unsaid, but nothing could obscure the picture. Lyndon Johnson was an overbearing, coarse, ruthless, sociopathic, lowlife, power-mad monster. Yes, he was a consummate politician, therefore could charm people when he had to, but the mask could easily slip, and often did. And, I go on there, and, the entire article gets into more, but a lot has come out in recent years about Lyndon Johnson that he was a complete maniac. And following the assassination, Lyndon Johnson became more and more paranoid, and the people that worked around him, people like Bill Moyers, all of these important White House staffers were worried that at any time he could come completely unglued, and there was no telling what he would do. This was a guy who would, just go to the bathroom in public. I mean, they'd be having a tour there of the LBJ ranch, and it didn't matter who was around. He'd just unzip and I'll take a leak right there in front of anybody. This was a guy who would grope other women in front of his wife, who was also a heavy drinker, who at any time they thought, my God, the Secret Service used to worry about him because they didn't know what he was going to do next. Lyndon Johnson was, I don't know if there's been anyone in history like that. You think of people like Caligula, who were not really wrapped tight mentally. And that's what Lyndon Johnson was. But he was much, much more ruthless, even than the Kennedys.
Well, that's no surprise. Johnson was notorious. There are stories. I think you mentioned it in your article, but ordering aides to, get in bed with him to keep him warm, and just outrageous, truly sociopathic.
Absolutely, and he had been implicated in so many strange deaths over the years, and it gets really interesting because in a previous book that came out about 10 years ago, this book is by Barr McClellan, who worked for the law firm that represented Lyndon Johnson here in Austin. Barr McClellan happens to be the father of Scott McClellan, who was, at the time the book came out, the press secretary for George W. Bush. And it's an interesting family. Barr McClellan's ex-wife, Scott's mother, is a former mayor of Austin, and she was the state comptroller at one time here. Well, in Barr McClellan's book, he had a lot of information, a lot of inside information as to the role that law firm had in helping to orchestrate the Kennedy assassination. And he also describes in there an individual by the name of Mack Wallace, who was someone who came under Lyndon Johnson's control very early, sometime in the early 50s, and who acted basically as Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman and was involved in numerous strange deaths. Well, Mack Wallace was the one who apparently murdered a Department of Agriculture investigator by the name of Henry Marshall, who was investigating these cons that Billy Saul Estes was running, and killed him, made it look like a suicide, but it was really clumsily done. And years later, Billy Saul Estes, who went on to do a considerable amount of time in the penitentiary, in a court trial that happened in the early 80s, a good 10 years after Lyndon Johnson's death, it was brought out and it was proven. And in fact, as a result of the verdict, it became the last official word on these murders, Henry Marshall's being the main one, that these were murders that Lyndon Johnson was involved in. And there was testimony. It was actually in the form of an affidavit because Billy Saul Estes was in prison. Billy Saul Estes gave a list of all the individuals to his knowledge. And we're talking situations where Billy Saul Estes sat in on the planning sessions for these murders. And it included Henry Marshall. It included numerous other individuals who knew about various crimes of Lyndon Johnson and were a threat to him in some way. It also included Lyndon Johnson's own sister, Josepha, who, due to her behavior, she was a a very active party girl here in Austin. Lyndon Johnson felt made him vulnerable to blackmail or to, a scandal. And the list also included John F. Kennedy. This was Billy Saul Estes's own, and this is an insider again, who described these murders and Mack Wallace's involvement. And a lot could be said about Mack Wallace. One interesting thing is that there were witnesses there in Dealey Plaza that afternoon who saw people up there in the 6th floor window of the school book depository, but they didn't look like Oswald. But one of them bore a strong resemblance to Mack Wallace. And there were some fingerprints that were found on the cardboard boxes that were used supposedly as a shield for one of the shooters in the famous sniper window that were never analyzed until years later. And a fingerprints expert analyzed them and compared them, and guess who they belonged to? Mack Wallace.
Well, they just didn't get around to some of the investigation in a timely manner, right?
That's right. There were a lot of things that,
they're going to happen in 2029 or whenever they release the files.
I don't think they'll ever be totally exposed.
Oh, well, I mean, I think even then we got to realize that some of these folks are, I don't know if you want to say covers, but they have people above them. I mean, right? I mean, if you talk about some mafia guy in New Orleans, yeah, but he may have been working for Meyer Lansky, for example, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? We can't, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Martin Bormann wasn't a key part in getting rid of Kennedy.
So many. It was a huge plot, but it's one of these things where there were so many involved on one level or another that it caused one individual who I think this was said by Chauncey Holt, who apparently was one of the so-called tramps who were arrested hiding in empty freight cars there behind the school book depository in the hour or so after the shooting. And he said that he thought that there were so many shady characters with interesting connections in Dealey Plaza that day that it seemed to him that that might have been part of the plot, was to just fill the Dealey Plaza with all these people who didn't necessarily have any, a particular thing they were supposed to do with the assassination, but they were just to be there to confuse things. And well, anything is possible. Planting false leads.
That's a strategy.
Well,
it's something to think.
for sure. But Mac, I mean, as an example, even in the Kennedy research world, the assassination research world, a lot of people have wanted to avoid different subjects because they're kind of messy or hard to get conclusive evidence about. And so, I'm sorry, Lenny, what'd you say?
Or they get killed. They're afraid of being,
Yeah, there's that. But I think it's not just that. It's also that some of this stuff is hard to get into, and some of the documents weren't out in a decent way. So we now know that the Kennedy administration was in total war with Israel, for example, over their nuclear program. And the prime minister of Israel was driven out. And, Johnson was a very big friend of Israel. And anyway, the Kennedys were at war with Israel. And I think we now have enough documents released to show that. And is that, to what extent is that relevant? And Meyer Lansky, the key gangster figure who, ends up going, to Israel because he can't be extradited, that kind of thing. And then, Mac, here's an example. I mean, Werner von Braun, in his autobiography in German, said he had a huge fight with Kennedy the day before he was killed over which propulsion system to use for the rockets, the going to the moon. And, I suspect that Kennedy and in his, promise that we'll go to the moon and back in 10 years, speech was trying to get NASA, the Nazis, to release better technology. Now, I admit to being a conspiracy theorist. I just very much suspect that what we saw on TV and some of that is not the best. In other words, I think we went to the moon, but I'm just saying that I have serious doubts about the public version of what we get to see. You know what I mean? The secret space program is probably tremendously more advanced.
Yes,
And that
that's what
relates to
I've
that.
heard over the years, and I have to take that seriously, although it's something that I don't have that much knowledge about, but I think it's common sense that you have to consider that whatever is put out there for the public consumption is probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Well, anyway, in addition to that, I have family connections to the rocket program, and they just, I mean, come on, they're not going to let you and let the Soviets and whoever see what they've got, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff of the early explorations that the Europeans made traveling around the world, a lot of that is still classified.
Wow.
Think about that. Stuff that happened 300 years ago, they won't let you. Do you think they're going to let you know what they find on the moon? Oh, well, we found unlimited gold and this rare mineral and, oh, come on, they're not going to tell you anything. And indeed, now people are admitting that the moon rocks are fake, right? They're moon rocks in different museums around the world. And they say, oh, by the way, those aren't real moon rocks.
Oh, I hadn't heard that, but
yeah, no,
that's
it's been
interesting.
admitted. The kids go to the museum. You take your kids to the museum and they get excited. Oh, I want to be an astronaut. And it's all a fake because they're not going to let you and the Soviets know what's on the moon. No way. If they do let the Soviets know, it's a secret deal in the back room, that's very controlled. And so I think you have to also look at the issue that Kennedy, if he's fighting the military-industrial complex, he's also fighting that element that overlaps into space because it's aerospace.
True. Well,
And
he
so
was really. Oh, go on. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lenny, please.
Well, I was just saying that Kennedy was a real agent of change. I mean, he was changing everything, or he was trying to, and I think that and then he got assassinated. I think there were just too many different people that were upset by his behavior, his actions, and his thoughts. I wanted to ask you, Mack, have you seen the photo that I know Jim Mars has it in one of his books of Lyndon Johnson while he's being sworn in, just before or after they're in the airplane, and Jackie Kennedy's standing next to him, and he turns around and he winks at somebody in the background.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
Yeah.
And that whole episode there on Air Force One is another thing that's really odd when you think about it. There was no real practical reason why Lyndon Johnson needed to be sworn in. I mean, he was president the moment that Kennedy was killed, but he insisted upon it. And everyone else around him, and we're talking really, especially the Kennedy staffers, were appalled that he would do what they thought was just so tasteless. That is, have this swearing in ceremony, and he would actually want to bring Jackie Kennedy out there, who was in a state of shock, and she still had, blood and brain matter all over her, and have her stand there. And the reason was because, he was becoming, having just committed this crime, he was desperate to get away with it and wasn't so sure that he would. And he wanted to make sure, absolute 101%, that he was president. And so he forced this thing when there was no reason for it, and said later, well, it was to, send a message to the world that there's, no, the transition of power and, all that stuff. That's all nonsense. He was actually very afraid that, because he didn't know, no one could have known for sure at that early hour that the thing had come off. And so it was a great relief to him when he was sworn in, and then he could really feel like he had control of the presidency, which he had lusted for all his life.
Yeah, yeah. I just don't quite understand how people can be like that, but he definitely is a fine example of a sociopathic personality who lusts for power.
A power-mad individual who showed signs early on in his life of being a sociopath. Barr McClellan points this out in his book, that if you read the highly acclaimed biography, it's 4 volumes, I think, by Robert Cairo, the highly acclaimed biography of Lyndon Johnson. Well, and the one that they sell copies of in the LBJ Museum gift shop, even though it is a very unflattering portrait of Lyndon Johnson. Well, there's so much that Cairo divulges, so many of these terrible stories about Lyndon Johnson's behavior. It comes from Robert Cairo, mining the materials that they have there in the LBJ library that I transcribed a great many of these back in the 70s. And yet I just, in parentheses, I have to say this: when it gets to the final volume of the biography, Robert Cairo, he won't touch the Kennedy assassination. He just goes Warren Commission all the way. Doesn't matter. He tells enough stories about Lyndon Johnson to give you a really good sense of his character. And one that is described in his childhood was that Lyndon Johnson would torture animals. And that is a sign of a very disturbed individual who's fully capable of someday doing anything to a human being.
That's a true sign of a sociopath.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a wonder how we all vote for those people or how they get elected.
Well, they are good at building coalitions of criminals, right?
And intimidating people.
Well, that's the other thing, is they use force, they use violence. And so, it's not like the average FBI agent is happy about what happened in Dallas.
No, they use blackmail and bribery and everything to build these coalitions of power. And what you just said there is very important to remember, that not every FBI agent was in on the plot. Not every CIA agent is in on these things. And that's one of the fascinating things here when you really dive into Kennedy assassination research, is that you discover that so much of the really good, useful information comes from, well, FBI agents, former FBI agents. For instance, there's a very strong case can be made that Lee Harvey Oswald was actually informing on this plot that he had infiltrated to kill Kennedy.
Yes, now we get into Judith Very Baker and all that.
Yes,
right?
That's right. And it's rather lengthy and complicated to describe, but there's a very strong case that can be made that Lee Harvey Oswald, a few days before the assassination, made a report to his FBI contact, James Hosty, in Fort Worth, that there was going to be a plot. And it can be, it's been documented that Oswald was in the office and he made some kind of report. And within hours, it goes out over the FBI wires that there is going to be an assassination attempt in Dallas on November 22nd. And it describes it down to the last detail. And this wire was seen by an employee of the FBI back in the New Orleans office. It came across and he saw it. William Deslat, I believe, was his name. Jim Garrison first found this witness, and he later testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations and so forth. He saw it, and the correct protocol would have been to act on this warning, which went out nationwide. but we only know about it because of this one FBI employee who swore to the, for years, I mean, that, and, that they tried to discredit him and all the rest and so forth. But he wrote down because when he saw this warning, he wrote it down word for word and he kept it. And we know about it because he made it public. But what happened was that the ultimate decision as to whether or not they should act on this warning rested with J. Edgar Hoover. And he was the one who just sat on it.
Well, there you go.
He's one of the killers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. Well, when you look back and read the history books in the Roman Empire, you see a kind of a similar situation. I mean, maybe this is just what happens when countries become too powerful, and they go through stages. I mean, after World War II, the U.S. was totally dominant in the world in every way. And you can imagine that somebody in whatever key family like the Rockefellers or DuPonts, if you control the military, well, that military is controlling the whole planet, right?
Yeah.
What are you going to think about two young brothers who come along and give you crap?
Yeah.
You're going to think they're insolent pieces of junk who are only there because they had a, halfway talented father.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to respect them at all. In other words, in the criminal world, maybe it's the Kennedys who don't have respect. You and I might have some respect for them, right?
Yeah.
But maybe in the world of Meyer Lansky and his friends, they didn't see the Kennedys as anything other than, lowlifes. And so that's another aspect of this. But I think now we might want to move on a little bit away from Johnson and Kennedy, because there's just so much. We could spend the whole show on that, and I wanted to go to a couple of other things. But I think one thing that's worth going over a little bit is what were called the yogurt shop murders. And the reason for going into this is it's kind of a little known issue in the U.S. is that insurance fraud is very serious, but in addition to that, it even leads to murder, including by powerful people. And I can't really do justice to this, but Mack, do you want to give an introduction? There was a yogurt shop in Austin, and some young girls were murdered.
Yes, this was a terrible crime. It's often called Austin's most notorious crime, the yogurt shop murders that happened in 91, I believe, a long time ago. And it remains unsolved, even though there were attempts through the years to coerce confessions from individuals. And at some point, they managed to get some convictions. 3 guys actually, did some time. But a few years ago, and this is since I wrote my article, which was in 2000, the individuals who were sentenced to prison, one, Robert Springsteen was his name, was on death row. Well, they were released. And so we're back to square one. Here is this terrible murder, the most terrible thing that's ever happened in Austin, even worse really than the UT tower shootings by Charles Whitman. This murder of 4 teenage girls in a yogurt shop late at night in North Austin. And it's Austin's dirty little secret, but it's also an open secret because a lot of people do know, have heard, and not just through my article, but other things that have been written, that there was something going on here that went beyond whatever kind of excuse they were putting out there that some random maniacs killed these girls. What really seems to have been at the bottom of it, according to a former assistant attorney general of the state of Texas, Eric Mobius, whom I interviewed in 2000 for this article, was that it comes down to insurance fraud, or as Mobius termed it insurance reserve fraud. And, well, it's a thing that most people have no understanding of, or they can't even comprehend how it could exist, how you could, benefit. Anyone could benefit from the insurance on an individual that they're not even related to. But the way the insurance laws are set up in the state of Texas, it absolutely can be done. And it gets rather lengthy and convoluted and complicated to describe, but just to sum it up very quickly, it is possible for some shady lawyers working for individuals to separate an individual from a claim, to tell a grieving mother in the emergency room at a hospital that she's got no case. Meanwhile, the lawyer knows that they do, but they can take this claim and transfer it over to someone else. Shady characters such as lawyers, criminals, basically, who can then collect on the accident or the catastrophic death or murder claim. They can collect on it, and because the laws are set up in such a way that they can do this invisibly. There's no oversight. There's no laws that allow the government or law enforcement to see what's done with that money. And that money, you can take a few $1 million and by laundering it and investing it and laundering it with drug money or whatever, turn that into many more millions and billions of dollars. And so what Mobius discovered was that there were so many of these construction site deaths, murders in convenience stores that had been stripped of their security, and ultimately the yogurt shop murders, which really shouldn't have happened, and that at the bottom of it was insurance fraud, that these were setups, that these deaths were planned, that they were allowed in order to make an immense profit. And in the case of the yogurt shop murders, you had this yogurt shop chain, which was owned by a company called Bryce Foods. And Eric Mobius's allegation was that Bryce Foods was in financial trouble, and they were going down, and something, seriously radical needed to be done to bring them out of this. Why they had even set up a scheme where it was actually investment fraud, where they knew that they had a business that was dying. It was a fad yogurt shops. It wasn't going to last. But they were, were telling investors, potential investors, that they were growing when in fact they were dying. And they even set up a phony yogurt shop plant, a yogurt plant, if you can imagine such a thing, in England. And they flew investors there, and they saw it, and it was all a fake to defraud them. But still, that wasn't enough. They were defrauding potential investors to the tune of immense amounts of money. And so ultimately what was done, and what Mobius alleges was orchestrated by a Austin-based lawyer, a powerful man, not only in the world of criminality and, managing his own criminal syndicate, but in state politics, very powerful, who I must refer to as Lawyer M. I can't say his real name. And that he had some experience, Mobius discovered, in setting up these kinds of things. His name turns up continually in all these incidents of, again, construction site deaths, convenience store murders, and what have you. And so it comes back to, this individual who apparently, according to Mobius, set this thing up, this terrible murder of 4 young girls. And, well, there's so much more that can be said about that. What's interesting?
Well, I think we can start by just saying that this problem is tremendously larger than most people can imagine. It's a way of laundering money, and it's a way of, what can I say? I mean, Walmart has the dead peasant policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've heard of that, Mack, right? The idea that you are legally allowed to collect on someone else's death that you have no relationship to
Mm-hmm.
is an incredible affront to logic and justice.
Yeah.
And I'm here in Japan, and there's a similar case, well, that's actually fairly a serious problem here, that you can do that. And the police and the media will never touch this topic. And so there are internet investigators and things like that. But it's just, how on earth is this legal? And the thing in this case in Austin with these murders that's interesting to me is that you've got Mobius, who was an assistant attorney general, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wasn't he something else like a mayor or some other kind of position?
No, that was his official title. And he, at a certain point, was acting as a lawyer for LULAC, which, if I can remember the way that acronym translates, the League for, well, anyway, it represents Latin American citizens, okay? Mm-hmm. And they had hired him because they noticed that there were a lot of these individuals who were dying in construction accidents and so forth who were Latin American. They were Hispanic. And well, as he got to digging into it, he discovered why. There was some insurance fraud going on. You would have the mother of a man killed in a accident at a construction site. There, in the emergency room, he dies, and a hospital representative, in complete violation of the law, comes to this woman who can't even speak English and recommends to her a lawyer, hands her a business card for a lawyer. Now, this hospital employee later testified that she did this in sworn testimony, that she did this thing illegally because she felt guilty, because she knew she was involved in something wrong. But be that as it may, recommends a lawyer to this poor woman who her son has died, and she can't speak English, so she goes to this lawyer. It's all a setup. The lawyer knows the moment she walks in the door that this is a claim that he can then take away from her, because then he'll say, okay, I'll investigate this, ma'am, and comes back a couple of days later and says, sorry, you don't have a case. What does she know? She can't even speak English. And what she doesn't know is, yeah, there's a case, and she has just been separated from the claim. So it was through his involvement with LULAC that Mobius became aware of this scheme. And then the story goes on, and as he began to dig deeper and deeper into it, amazed that this immense criminal fraud was happening. Digs deeper and deeper into it, he discovers that there was an insurance fraud angle with regard to Austin's most notorious crime, the yogurt shop murders. And it's huge, and it is international. That's something that Mobius did touch on in the interview that I did with him, is that it's not just confined to Texas.
Yeah. One of the reasons I bring this up, this whole topic, it's a little complicated, and people might have a little trouble relating to it. But this is one of the great underreported criminal stories of our time. There's not just, like I said, all these dead peasant policies at places like Walmart. There's also this just incredible criminality, like what happened with these yogurt shop murders. They're, you know, some of these murders that make no sense, so to speak, are not simply like people speculate they're satanic cults or they're initiation rites, right, at some gang. And undoubtedly there are all these things, but there's also just so many cases where you say, look, the cops had to be in on this, right? I mean,
That's right.
if nothing else, they're covering it up. And then you see key legal firms that had to be somehow involved, or some key lawyer. And so I think we're getting back to this problem we got with Johnson. We got too many sociopaths. I mean, this Mr. M sounds like a protege of LBJ.
Yes, and in fact, you can draw some kind of a connection there because one of the interesting things I've learned in this research that Mobius and some other individuals that I can't name who have continued to doggedly research this over the years is that this lawyer M has been active in Austin for many decades and still is. And back in '77, that would be the first year that I was living in Austin, there was a murder that happened that grabbed the headlines here in Austin. At that time, Austin was, really a small town comparatively. And except for the tower shootings, murders were not that common. This one was the murder of a high school teacher over on the west side of town, an affluent area. This high school teacher was shot by a student. Now, this was long before school shootings were all over the news and everyone was, talking about it. This was a complete anomaly, and this student shot this teacher and killed him right in the classroom. And the student was an interesting individual. He was the son of one George Christian, who was one of the press secretaries that worked for Lyndon Johnson during his presidency. And what brings this into this story that we're talking about is that one of the first individuals on the scene, I was told by this, again, Mobius, a former assistant attorney general of Texas, and a few other people, one of the first persons that showed up there before there was even a police report that went out was Lawyer M. Now, I have no idea what that was about. It's something that people who research this wonder about, and no one has any explanation. But it shows you that whatever, criminal syndicate that was alive and well in the Austin area during Lyndon Johnson's time, well, there's still a big criminal syndicate. And you have to wonder if there's some kind of lineage there between what Lawyer M is running and Lyndon Johnson's big political machine. I was told and have been told by more than one insider that Lawyer M not only is powerful in the Texas State Democratic Party, he is the Texas State Democratic Party. And this brings us to a recent development, which is this. We have here in Travis County, where Austin, the capital city of Texas, is located. In Travis County, in the district attorney's office, we have an unusual situation. First off, my sources have told me that the district attorney, for a number of years, has been controlled by this criminal syndicate I'm talking about. And that would make sense because this is the district attorney's, office that has pursued the yogurt shop investigation and many others and has done nothing but try to railroad innocent people. And it doesn't stop there. The Travis County District Attorney's Office is, I don't think there's another one like it in the entire nation. It is the home of something called the Public Integrity Unit, which gives the Travis County DA's office jurisdiction over the entire state's political officials, state officials, elected officials, both state and federal. If you are a U.S. congressman from Texas, and if, like Tom DeLay, good example, if Tom DeLay suddenly finds himself in trouble, but who's prosecuting him? It's the Travis County District Attorney's Office. And Tom DeLay, a Republican. Former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, another one that the Travis County DA's Public Integrity Unit tried to go after. Now, the allegation here is that the Public Integrity Unit, being a part of this district attorney office, which is owned through blackmail and bribery and so forth, the way that Lawyer M controls so many individuals in places of importance, that the Public Integrity Unit is a tool of the Texas State Democratic Party to go after political enemies. Now, what happened recently, about 6 or 7 months ago, was that the current district attorney, Rosemary Limburg, was arrested on a DWI charge here in Travis County. And it was an outrageous situation because she's driving down Highway 620, one of the most dangerous highways in this area, and she's weaving in and out of traffic. She's on the wrong side of the road, and she almost hits a few cars head on. A citizen sees this, gets on his cell phone and calls, and she, in the meantime, has pulled over into a church parking lot. The Travis County Sheriff's Office shows up because it's outside the Austin city limits, so it's the Sheriff's Office jurisdiction here. And she's given the DWI test and all the rest, and she's out of control. I mean, she's spitting on the officers, she's cursing them and so forth. And of course, they've got a problem here. They got the district attorney, and they're having to manage her. And all this is being recorded on video. And it's all over YouTube, by the way. And they take her back to the sheriff's office, put her in jail. And she's so out of control, they have to put a bag over her head. Well, in any other district attorney's office in the nation, this individual would have been out of a job the next day. But that didn't happen because of the political importance of that position. She refused to resign. And we're talking the citizens of Austin and Travis County up in arms. There were protests held. Protests held on overpasses over the main highway, the interstate that comes through town at rush hour. She's got to resign. She's got to resign. I'm telling you, the police association was demanding her resignation, but she wouldn't. Meanwhile, there's a small demonstration held on the steps of the courthouse, organized by Lawyer M, who I'm told is the one who owns her. And this thing goes on and on. It drags on, and she never resigns. But guess what? The governor of Texas, Rick Perry, gets involved. He's a Republican, see? And he's saying that if she doesn't resign, he's going to defund the Public Integrity Unit. The reason she won't resign is, and this is the thing that the mainstream news media reports won't get into, but it's important. It's essential to understanding what's happening. The reason she won't resign is because if she does, then Governor Perry, who's a Republican, gets to appoint a district attorney to fill her place for the next 2 years. And it means that the Republicans then have the control of the Public Integrity Unit to use against the Democrats. And it also means that a certain individual, Lawyer M, who has a lot of crimes to cover up, it means that, well, he's in trouble because guess what? Among the many crimes that the Public Integrity Unit of Travis County oversees is insurance fraud.
Oh, Mac, first of all, that title, the Public Integrity Unit, sounds very much like it's out of the French Revolution or something to me. It's got a kind of Robespierrean feeling to it, I'm afraid. So I'm not so keen on that. But this reminds me of something. Having spent time in Texas, I like Texas in many ways, but there's one big reason I don't think I want to live there again, and that's basically the police. The police system there leaves a lot to be desired. And you know what I mean? It's like in California, the bureaucracy is horrible or something, right? If you have a business dealing with regulations or something, everywhere's got its problems, right?
Yeah, right.
But I can just assure you that, if you've been there, you just don't want to deal with, it's over the top in some ways. So,
and this at a time in our history when the police are becoming out of control all over the nation. And as you might expect, there's a particular reason to fear the police here in Texas. Absolutely. But
well, there's this long history dealing with people like Johnson. There's this long, it's going back, and the oil guys and all that. You know what I mean? It's Jim Mars talks about his time there in Dallas, and it's kind of like, well, Jack Ruby, we see him every other day, and you know what I mean? It's like a club. They work together.
Yeah, and for those cops, and I have a couple of cop friends who try to buck the system, it can be very dangerous. I was mentioning earlier this trial in the 80s that reopened the investigation into the death of Henry Marshall. Supposedly, not supposedly, definitely at the hands of Lyndon Johnson. Well, the individual who did the most to, cause this case to be reopened and who, again, was successful in getting a court verdict that proved what he was saying was a certain Texas Ranger by the name of Clint Peoples, because he began investigating this in the 60s. Not only the death of Henry Marshall, but all these other Lyndon Johnson related deaths. Clint Peoples was on it, and he stayed on it. And he had his victory in the courtroom in the early 80s. It didn't make a lot of news, of course. The mainstream media ignored it, but it's a fact that basically 10 years after his death, Lyndon Johnson was found guilty of the death of all these people. But the thing is, a year or two later, Clint Peoples was dead.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Hey, I'm here. Mack?
Yeah.
I would like for you to make any comment you want to on the situation we have with the militarization of the police and the thuggishness of the police now. We've had a situation to arise here locally where a young man has been killed by a local policeman, not a sheriff's deputy, but a policeman. I'm having to be very careful because I am somewhat close to some of the people involved. But in any case, it is a great concern. And more than just talking about how it has arisen, what are we going to do about it?
Oh, boy, is that a good question. First, though, it's important that people do know how it happened, because the average individual out there are gradually becoming acclimatized to what amounts to an epidemic of police brutality.
Yeah, I can vouch for that because I had a situation with my wife about that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think that education is really important here. People need to understand that this has been a systematic program that has been going on for decades. I believe it started in the 68. And it was partly as a result of the tower shootings here in Austin by Charles Whitman that there began to be this push nationwide for SWAT teams and military hardware for the police. And well, that has gradually over time snowballed and snowballed into a situation where now the so many police departments have military hardware that is so dangerous and scary that it's not even used in Afghanistan. And well, how did we get here? Well, a lot of it has happened as a result of the creation of the Department of the Homeland Security following September 11th, the day of the terror attacks, the day the world changed, as we're told over and over again. And due to this, fear of terrorism, well, all of these police departments have been taking advantage of that by going to Homeland Security, where there are billions of dollars awaiting them that can be used to beef up their police departments with all sorts of things that they really don't need. Military hardware and drones and all kinds of ungodly weaponry. And something else has changed, and that is the culture of police. Their training has evolved from a place where at one time, I remember once when I was a young man, about 19 years old, I ran out of gas and on a highway, and I was walking along to get to the nearest gas station. There was a cop there sitting by the side of the road, with his radar pointed at the traffic. And I asked him if he could give me a ride. And he said, sure, hop in, I'd be afraid to approach a cop under any circumstances now, because the cop culture now is that the citizen is the enemy, and it's this us against them mentality. And there's also there's been a change in hiring practices. I have a cop friend. I won't say what police department he works at here in Texas, but we talk frequently, and he tells me he's been in that job now for about 20 or more years. And he says that even he is scared of some of these new guys that they're hiring because they've lowered standards. They lowered the IQ qualification. I mean, there was a lawsuit somewhere I read about recently where an applicant to become a policeman was automatically disqualified because his IQ was too high. And they're also intentionally recruiting people who are, well, thugs, basically.
Do you have any notion of what the IQ number is that's too high?
I wish I had that article at hand, and I don't, but it can be easily found on the internet. I've posted it more than once on Facebook because people can't believe it, but it's true. The other thing is that there was a time when police could be disqualified from serving as a policeman if their personality profile showed that they were too military. Because you have to have some flexibility if you're going to go out there and work as a peace officer, which is what my friend still likes to refer to himself as. But it's the opposite now. They view the American citizen as the enemy. Now, that's the quick wrap up of how we got here, and to a place to where, my gosh, killings of innocent civilians by the police happen on a daily basis now. And we're talking all over the nation, not just in Texas. It's everywhere. Are just pointless taserings of individuals who didn't do anything. Maybe they didn't obey an order faster enough. That they're using tasers, which were originally invented and given to police to be used as an alternative to deadly force. And they're using them now for compliance. And if you don't move it fast enough, if you don't obey an order, or sometimes there was a case here in Austin, the cop pulls this guy over, tells him to get out of the car. The guy gets out of the car. He gets tasered anyway. We have an out-of-control police We
But
need a national investigation of it. We need congressional studies of this, and it's not happening. And that's the scary thing, is that we have this epidemic of police brutality, and people are just becoming acclimatized to it, like frogs boiling in the pot.
But Mac, I think that police brutality happened a lot way before that. It was going on during the Vietnam War years, that's for sure. Certainly, the killings of college students at Kent State was incredibly violent, and I don't recall that ever happening before. Student protesters getting killed like that. A couple of years before Kent State, we had the riots in Chicago at the Democratic Convention. That's where the anti-war protesters fought the police at the Democratic Convention just before the elections.
Oh, absolutely. You can go back to the Chicago 68 conventions, which
Right,
I watched live on television. I'm 61. I'm not that young. In fact, you can go back to the bonus army marching on Washington, and police brutality has always been there as a problem, okay? But it has intensified dramatically over the past, few decades, but especially since 9/11.
Oh, I agree with that. I just wanted to point out it was it's a long-standing trend in the police culture to be a little heavy-handed and close-minded.
That's right. And, they were brutal in the 60s. The Kent State killings were horrific.
They were terrible.
And, later on, the Occupy movement.
But Mac,
yes.
Kent State happened, okay, in the Vietnam War period, how many, young guys or young gals did the police kill? And then now, that's not even newsworthy. Happens every day.
That's the problem. They kill people.
That's true.
They kill, Lenny, they kill for no reason now.
That's true.
And on YouTube, you can see it's worse than that in a sense. It's not just that they kill people. They, they're sticking their hands inside your body for no reason. That
that's
kind of
happened. There have been numerous cases, and there were the first two that I heard about, or anybody heard about, were here in Texas, roadside cavity searches being performed by DPS. That's the state troopers here in Texas, Department of Public Safety, where the cops just pull over some women driving down the road, and with no real probable cause decide to search them for drugs. And right there in full view of cars on the freeway driving past, they do cavity searches. And it's not just confined to Texas, bad as Texas might be. There have been cases in Florida of that happening. There was a terrible case like that in Wisconsin. More recently, there have been these weird cases in New Mexico where someone is picked up, and it's not just women. There was one case where it was a woman, but there were two other cases I know of in New Mexico where it was men. They're picked up by the cops. Again, no probable cause. And they're taken to a hospital and subjected to colonoscopies, and they're made to defecate in front of the hospital staff and the police and all this, and no drugs are found, and they go through this terrible, humiliating, physically terrible ordeal, and guess what? They're stuck with the hospital bill. And that's just one example. Over and over again, there are all these cases of individuals who are just, the police are called because there's some kind of disturbance. They show up and they just shoot the first person they see, or they shoot the dog. That's the latest thing is to immediately go in and just shoot all the animals and anything that moves. And this was not happening until recently. There would be these isolated incidents like this for years, and well, that would have at one time caused a lot more public uproar than it does now. It causes an uproar now, but the uproar seems to just be kind of lost in just all the uproar of everything else going on. And we are definitely in the midst of a police brutality epidemic, the likes of which we've never seen. Yeah, at one time it was directed against, a few protesters against the Vietnam War. Now it can be anybody. I mean, you can be the one who called the police because you have an intruder on your property, and you can end up be the one shot. That happens
Mac,
over and over.
I think one of the lessons we can draw from this is the old sayings about how what you permit to happen to unpopular groups or minority groups or whatever will eventually spread. And so, to some extent, what's happened in the U.S. in the last, 30 years or something, is the bad treatment that might have happened on American Indian reservations or to prisoners or whatever has spread, so that now the schools are like prisons. And now the suburbs are getting what used to be reserved for the worst inner city neighborhoods. You know what I mean? It's kind of like we never got control over the cops, and then now they've taken control of us.
Well, that trend of police brutality has been there for years. That's one reason why so many years ago Mark Twain hated the police all his life, and the reason was because when he was a young guy, starting out in the newspaper business and as a writer and columnist in San Francisco, he not only had these terrible run-ins with the cops himself, but he would see the way that the San Francisco cops in the 1860s would treat the Chinese. And then you go forward in time, Wounded Knee. Now, that's an interesting one to just focus on for a moment, because after the terrible thing at Waco happened, just up the road from where I live here in Austin, where you had all of these people, men, women, children, innocent people, who were burned alive or shot down as they ran outside of the building, shot down by the police. It was a massacre by the police. But the Native American activist Russell Means pointed out at the time that, you know what this is? This is the white man's wounded knee. They're doing it to you now. They're not just doing it to the Indians or to the blacks, and that is the canary in the coal mine. That's what Waco.
I agree. That's what I thought too. I just thought this is the normalization, if you want to call it, of what was on the fringe. And that's what I think we saw after 9/11 is the normalization of police brutality that had been kind of on the fringe, as I said, like young black guys with a criminal record, that kind of thing, or Rastafarian haircuts or something, right? Because I had a friend whose uncle was a cop, and he carried drugs. He planted them on blacks that had bad attitude, as he saw it. Rastafarians.
This is a great time for a series of comic books on educating people about police brutality and I think it would be a great on corruption, and within the not just the police force, but corruption in society with all our organizations, and I think that would be a great thing to do, Mac.
Yes, it would, and the alternative media is the only area, whether we're talking comics or video or radio, the alternative media is the only place where we're really going to see any coverage of all of these issues to any great extent. I've been surprised and gratified at times to see that you do see all across the nation where incidents such as police brutality occur, that there will be coverage in the local media, but it just goes down the memory hole and it's forgotten and it just gets lost with all the rest of it. And I don't know but what somehow possibly the coverage in the mainstream media doesn't have the effect of conditioning people, of desensitizing them to what's going on. But these things need to be kept alive in the alternative media. And, we're having this conversation right now, and it'll be listened to by, great numbers of people and so forth. This is the alternative media right here. The radio show that I do, it's an internet radio station, and, that's where it's happening. And there, the alternative media documentaries and so forth, and using social media as much as you can to put the word out and to educate people. And more people, I got to say, as a result of that, of using the internet, using alternative media, using comics, but all the other media, has resulted in more wide awake people than I've seen in a long time. Because in the years following Waco, for instance, that was a very lonely time to be an activist trying to get people to listen to what had happened at Waco, because it hadn't really developed yet, not fully. The alternative media, the internet was in its infancy.
Yeah.
And but gradually over time, we've seen that change. And I remember it was sometime in the late 90s. I first saw Alex Jones. And where did I see him? On cable access TV here in Austin. And he, kept building on that, and he eventually created his own media empire, but it started out very small. Alex has done a lot, but he's not the only one. There are so many of us who have been talking about these things for years, Waco, and then later 9/11 and so forth. And, you have documentaries now, Loose Change, whatever, that are really having an enormous effect. I've never seen people more awake than they are. But the problem is there still aren't enough because you got to wonder, what's it going to take to actually affect some change, And I don't have the answer to that. I just know
Starvation.
Yeah, things getting so bad that they got to take action. I mean, it's got to feel personal to them, I guess.
Yeah, probably.
Well, I mean, we've been asking this for a long time, but I mean, there's always some outrage, and it didn't do the trick. I thought the MOVE events in Philadelphia were some of the classic evil, in the last 100 years in the U.S. and
which preceded Waco,
which was before Waco, and it involved tremendous collateral damage to surrounding neighborhoods, homes, and people. And in the whole MOVE crackdown, Lord knows how many innocent people had their, jaws broken or whatever. And suffice it to say, the police brutality won. You know what I mean? The police mindset led to further mayors and things like that. You know what I mean? In other words, they could campaign and be proud of what they'd done.
Yeah, because they
control
on
the
law
media
and
is the
order
problem.
platform, and people will, there's a psychological thing. They want to identify with the aggressor, and that's very frustrating to deal with. I see it all the time, and I don't know what it would take. I think it's so easy to demonize whole groups of people. Demonize first blacks or whoever, or demonize convicts,
Mack, did you ever read any of the books by Wilhelm Reich? He's an interesting and somewhat controversial guy, but he was, I guess, like a cousin or nephew of Sigmund Freud or whatever. But he
studied under Freud.
He fled from the Nazis, and he came to the U.S. and then he got persecuted here, and ended up dying in prison. And he's an interesting character with inventions, but two things of note. One is he wrote these books on the mass psychology of fascism and things like that, like Wake Up Little Man and whatever. And we can disagree with some of his ideas that people need physical touching to release tension and stuff like that, but the bigger point, though, is there is this people who are frustrated and feel weak get off on seeing violence, right? The abuse of power. In other words, they don't have it. Anyway, it's worth looking into some of his stuff. And by the way, he had, before he died, he said he was being persecuted by communists because, you see, he'd been in a communist cell in Europe. And everyone laughed and said, that's totally impossible. There aren't any, what are you talking about, communists in America? But later a book was done on his life, recently in the last 5 or 10 years with a lot of FOIA requests. And indeed, the persecution did come from a lot of these communist neocon types.
Absolutely, yes.
And
That's
they were
true.
totally unforgiving, and they have that totalitarian mindset. You see, because he had been a communist, but quickly he came to the conclusion they're just as bad as the Nazis.
Yes, there were a lot of them like him who came to that conclusion, who thought originally that the communists are going to be our saviors, and looked, it didn't work out that way. Yes, and Reich's books were burned. It's a terrible story, and it's true that a number of his writings and so-called discoveries, well, they may or they might not be, crackpot stuff, but when you really get into the study of the mentality of fascism, I have to wonder if that wasn't what they really wanted to suppress, because this happened at a time when we were beginning to see the early steps of the Nazification of America.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
He said, absolutely, America's going hardcore totalitarian.
He saw it early on at a time when most individuals, they just couldn't have seen it. They couldn't have guessed at it, but that's exactly what was happening. And the Operation Paperclip, the very formation of the CIA, deep Nazi links. Earlier we were talking about Werner von Braun and NASA. A lot of old Nazis there, and that gets back to the Kennedy assassination. A really interesting book to read is the Torbett document, which for years circulated just as a mimeographed copy that was passed around, but it's now been available as an actual book that you can buy, and it describes the NASA connection, i.e., the Nazi connection to the JFK killing.
Mack, when I mentioned Martin Bormann, who of course was the Nazi leader in Argentina, he was number 2 in the Nazi party, and then he went to Argentina after the war. That organization, the underground Nazi organization, is called the Bormann Organization. And I think there's a lot of evidence that they were key players because of several reasons. But one is the world weapons companies. Perhaps the biggest player is Krupp.
Oh, yeah.
People don't quite appreciate this is $1 trillion family in all the world's, well, maybe not in Russia and China as much, but I mean, it's a long story, but there definitely seems to be a strong connection between the Nazis coming out of Argentina and the Kennedy assassination. And perhaps it's just business. I mean, they wanted to sell weapons. They needed wars and a Cold War and stuff like that. I don't know. Maybe it was more ideological. I don't know. But his idealism was not their pragmatic, more business and brutal way of doing things.
Yes, to a great degree, I think that the Nazis were set up. They were a creation of something much larger and sinister behind the scenes. There's also IG Farben, the great, chemical cartel, which supposedly that's the one that supplied the gas that was used in the Holocaust and so forth. And I forget all the details, but this was a Rockefeller company, basically.
Well, Mac, the key there is that IG Farben had all this great technology, including energy technology like gasification and other technical means, which was a tremendous threat to the oil crowd. And before World War II, the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests and IG Farben did a massive share swap, like they exchanged 40% of each other's shares, so that IG Farben owned 40% of Standard Oil and Standard Oil owned 40% of IG Farben, something along those lines. And so, of course, during the war, the U.S. wouldn't bomb IG Farben facilities or whatever, headquarters or stuff like that, right? Because they're friends of the Rockefellers. Well, not just friends, I mean, deep partners, in other words. And so I think that's another factor with that whole post-war Nazi environment in terms of fighting Kennedy is it's not simply that they're Nazis, it's that they're Rockefellers.
It gets very confusing, and it's hard at this late date with limited access to knowledge and so forth. But early on, the Kennedys were Nazi sympathizers, right?
Yes, I know. That's why I think it's interesting. Is there are quotes from Jack Kennedy and whatever saying they were an amazing phenomenon in terms of what they were trying to achieve, and the world will not understand them for 100 years and stuff like that. And so he wasn't fanatically anti-Nazi or anything like that. But by the way, talking about Waco, because you're not that far from that was also one of these escalation points. Did you go out there? What did you feel, see? Did you get a chance to talk to any of the reporters, or what did you come to any conclusion?
Yes, that was something I got involved in, and it's hard to believe it's been so many years since that happened, over 20 years now. But that was one of the things. That was one of the big turning points in my life. The JFK assassination. I was living in Dallas at the time. I was 11 years old when it happened, and I went to the assassination site the next morning with my father, who was a newspaper man, and it made a huge impression on me. And that was the first turning point. The second big turning point in my life was my involvement in the Waco research, because I have a very long-time friend. We go back many decades, Richard Mosley, who during the 51-day siege at Waco began laying the groundwork for a documentary about it. He didn't know where this thing was going, and well, of course, where it eventually went was a terrible Holocaust that killed all these innocent people. And his documentary, Day 51, The True Story of Waco, was one of the first ones to be made. It was made during that first year after the fire at Waco, and I was involved in doing the research for that film, and in fact, am even interviewed in the film about some of the research. But in the course of that, got to know the surviving Branch Davidians in that first year after this terrible thing that happened. And there were so many things I learned from that. One was that, these people had been characterized in the media as these religious nuts. And I got to know them, and there wasn't anything, more crazy about them than about someone that belongs to the Catholic or the Baptist church, But the other thing that we learned in the course of interviewing the Davidians was that there was more to the motivations for the attack on their home and church than was being broadcast in the mainstream media. One thing that was evident to a lot of people was that this appeared to be used as a test case, that, well, we can use gun control as the rationale to go in there and attack these people, and violate the Constitution and do all these terrible things, but it will all be justified because we're protecting the public from these terrible gun nuts and religious nuts. And it was a means to demonize people who have different beliefs, who are living a communal lifestyle off the grid and all that. But the other thing that we discovered in talking to the surviving Davidians was that there was possibly another motivation, which was that somewhere in the Mount Carmel complex where they lived, there was information on computers that might have been deemed injurious, dangerous to the government. And this gets back to something that was going on in the years leading up to the Clinton administration. This was the Inslaw case, where the Promise software had been developed, which would basically this company developed this software, a law enforcement software, that was then sold to other countries and so forth for use in tracking cases, but it had a trap door in it, meaning that whoever sold them the software, in this case the NSA, would be able to track everything that this country or whatever law enforcement agency did going forward. And there were a lot of things going on at the time leading up to Waco. There was this strange incident regarding Vince Foster, who died in the aftermath of Waco and who told his wife that he felt responsible for what happened at Waco. And that was part of his emotional state leading up to his apparent suicide, but likely murder. So much going on at the time. But the thing that we learned from the Davidians was that there were two top lieutenants of David Koresh's, Jeff Martin and Wayne Little, who arrived there at this commune, basically, which was an international population of people. They were from all over. And these guys appeared to be some kind of intelligence operatives. They had worked for some kind of, I think it was the Yamaha Corporation, as I recall, one of them. I'm not sure if it was Martin or Little, but at any rate, it was known among the Davidians that they were conducting some kind of investigation of the government, and they were using some kind of new law enforcement software that sounded a lot like the Promise software. And that on the day of the raid on Waco, February 28th, the first day, that we all know, it was established a fact at the time, that the ATF knew that whatever guns were on the premises of the Davidians' residence there, in this legally licensed gun shop, by the way, that all of those guns had been taken out that morning to be brought to a gun show here in Austin. And yet the raid went ahead anyway, in the full knowledge there were no guns there to confiscate. Why? Because the room in the building that you see the officers pouring into, and where there were 3 of them shot after they went in the window, that wasn't the gun shop. They were never after the guns. They were after the computers that Koresh and his 2 top lieutenants had there in that room, where was stored the information that was apparently so dangerous.
Okay,
And-
Mac, but now we
yeah.
got to get into something important here. So how on earth would guys like Koresh be playing with such sensitive things?
Well,
In other words,
that's a good
who's
question.
behind them? Who's
Yeah,
behind them?
that's the thing that has really fascinated me, because when you start really looking at it, well, who is or who was David Koresh? Well, first of all, that wasn't his real name. His name was Vernon Howell. And he didn't acquire the name David Koresh until after a trip to Israel, and where he had some kind of a transforming experience, a vision, and a voice in his head told him that you'll now be known as David Koresh. Now, I got to pause for a moment here and say, that the individuals that I met who were, the survivors of this terrible thing, these people didn't, have, any knowledge beyond what I just described here. And they, believe things I don't believe, but then a lot of people believe things I don't believe. But that's apart from what kind of thing was Koresh involved in, and who was he? Who was he really working for? On the first year anniversary of what happened at Waco, we set up a pavilion there. It was called the Day of Information, and where we were selling the video. And at a certain point there, I was in charge of the booth, and this guy walked up to me and introduced himself to me as a Branch Davidian minister. And I remembered having seen him on the news during the siege. And, because it turns out that this wasn't the only Branch Davidian church in Waco. There was another one in town that was much smaller. And this was the minister of this thing. And he started telling me things. He said, I don't know if you realize this, but Koresh was working for the CIA. And at that time, I didn't have enough knowledge yet. I had learned a lot, but I hadn't learned, enough yet. So when I heard this, I thought, well, that sounds crazy. I can't compute this. He says, yeah, he was working for the CIA, and he had a bioweapons lab here in this facility. Now, I still don't know if that's true, but I've heard that since then, in different contexts, that there was something going on inside the Mount Carmel, that it was a front for some kind of intelligence activity.
Sounds like David Ferry.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I read, and I'm not, promoting this. I'm not saying I believe this, but it's just an example of the sorts of things that came out. In the aftermath of Waco and Vince Foster's mysterious death, there was a Washington attorney by the name of Paul Wiltshire who began doing a big investigation of his own. And he wrote a long memo to Janet Reno, the Attorney General at that time, describing all these things that he had discovered. And then he turns up dead under mysterious circumstances. And his findings made their way onto the internet, and, take them for what they're worth. But once again, I found myself encountering the same allegation, that there was some kind of a bioweapons factory there in Mount Carmel, the building that was later burned. And that what had happened, if you'll recall, David Koresh came to power in this at this church by overthrowing the previous head, a guy by the name of George Roden. And there was a gun battle there. This was several years before the big news about Waco, and at a time when nobody had ever heard about the Branch Davidians. There was a gun battle, and George Roden was then removed from power, and David Koresh and his faction took over. And one of the things that the Davidians told me, and that's public knowledge now, was that when they went in and took the place over, they discovered a big meth factory that Roden was running. And just a side note about George Roden, he always claimed to have some kind of connection with the state of Israel. And on one occasion, you see, he was eventually committed to an insane asylum, I believe, of some kind in Big Spring, Texas. And he escaped one time and managed to make his way all the way to New York City to the doorstep of the Israeli embassy. And What that was all about, I don't know. But eventually he died. Well, the allegation here of this attorney, Paul Wiltshire, and a few others, was that Koresh, under orders from whoever was controlling him, some suggest by mind control, that David Koresh transformed the facilities that were being used to, manufacture methamphetamine into a bioweapons facility where they were making sarin gas. And it was Wiltshire's contention that there was a plot to release sarin gas in Oklahoma City about a year or two before the events at Waco. And his allegation further went on to say that Koresh and his assistants were under mind control, that they were some kind of sleeper agents or whatever, but that for whatever reason, they apparently, the control didn't work. They if they were sleeper agents, they woke up and they decided not to do it. They decided to go off on some rogue, agenda of their own, and they didn't do it. And that was one more reason for raiding the facility at Waco and shutting it down. There were all kinds of things going on there, and that this coming at a time when it was early on in the Clinton administration and a lot of strange things happening. Now, those are just,
Mack,
I present all this stuff here is speculation.
Mack,
Those
I think
I've heard.
we could have a whole show dedicated to this because I'm familiar somewhat with the whole story of the sarin gas, which wasn't sarin gas, attack in Tokyo in the subways.
Yeah, that was huge.
Which happened around that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talk about somebody from Yamaha Corporation being involved and the CIA and bioweapons research, the cult in Japan, the Om Shinrikyo, is very interesting because it's something that would have like a top KGB guy and top Soviet general in it.
Yeah.
Doing massive weapons research, generating earthquakes in Australia, which had never had earthquakes to speak of, of any size, and strange things in the sky and stuff. If you've looked into them, you realize that they were a front for high-level factions that we can't even exactly relate to.
Yeah.
And it's more or less at the same time, give or take. So this raises all kinds of questions as to whether, there's the lower level kind of strange cult beliefs that are to turn people off so they don't look into what the group is doing. You know what I mean? A normal policeman is not going to want to go to a place where you've got 100 religious wackos, essentially, right? Doing strange things like free love and meditation and pretending to levitate and all kinds of stuff, right? And then that's a cover. Behind that, they've got something else going on, like in this case in Japan with the methamphetamine question was an allegation against them, and various bioweapon stuff and different gas. But a lot of it, the facilities couldn't have made. There's no residue of what they are said to have been doing. And reporters, when the attack happened in the subway, it's the same thing. The local police started saying what it was, and then essentially a controller guy came in front of the press and said, "You didn't hear that. This was sarin gas. That's the official line from the government." But there were reporters who heard the local police say, "No, it wasn't sarin." And so anyway, we could go on a long time, but there may well be. It's the same time. It's the same kind of feeling. It's got some of the same lies and cover stories. It's possible. There may be a strong relationship between, and for example, when the sarin gas attack went down, immediately a key CIA guy flew over from the U.S. to Japan and started putting out all kinds of information, and he had a control team working for him. And a number of journalists and others, over 100 were killed in Japan, easily. of people who didn't go along with the cover-up properly. So it was a big, big deal. And you just can't imagine anything other than stuff like very serious high-tech weapons, and you know what I mean? Whatever it was important, at least in Japan. And then with the way they handled Waco, it's just like you're saying, Mac, it wasn't about guns. And even the idea that it's the BATF and they want funding is probably also another cover story. That might be what they tell the guy at the bottom, or a reporter who doesn't ask very many good questions, right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of answer he'll believe. But when you look into these suspicious things, like you're saying, who was this David Koresh? And I don't know, more questions than answers, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you often do have multiple agendas, and a lot of those agendas seem to be false leads.
Yes, of course.
And the other thing is that cults make perfect fronts for intelligence or criminal activities because, they just look like these crazy crackpots that, who knows why they did what they did. And the other thing is, you can have all kinds of activities going on inside the church down the street, but it's not going to attract attention. It's a church, people come and go at odd hours and, no one thinks about it. And the other thing is too, David Koresh was always traveling. He was always on the move, going to Australia, going to Israel, back and forth. He had a strong Hollywood connection. There was in fact, there's some research I've read that indicates that there was an Israel-connected mob there called the Davidian Gang, a fellow by the name of Abraham Davidian, who was connected to, various Jewish gangsters who had deep ties to some of the early activities in the setting up of Israel. So it gets really murky there as to who's who and what's what. But the thing is that in the simple act of traveling and crossing national borders, it's a perfect front because, well, he's a missionary. He's going here and there on missionary work. Which is why, for instance, when Lee Harvey Oswald made a trip to Mexico City at a key moment in the month or two leading up to the Kennedy assassination, he was in the company of this shady character who was some kind of missionary. And this also, you can find a parallel with the evangelical organization known as World Vision, which has been identified by a number of researchers, including John Judge and so forth, as a front for CIA activities and assassinations, and is even believed to have been a front for the recruiting of Mark David Chapman, who was, the one who at least is serving time for killing John Lennon. Well, when in fact that plot may have been more than just another lone nut. But where did Chapman come from? He came from, working in these refugee camps that were being run by World Vision. And World Vision is believed to have recruited it's believed to have recruited. They set up refugee camps in Central America where they were bringing in individuals from Nicaragua and El Salvador who were then recruited into the death squads. That's the allegation. But again, it's the perfect cover. Religion, God, spirituality, missionary work.
Mac, you spend time in Florida, or at least you did back in the day. It was kind of funny. You had all these religious groups that wanted to drop Bibles off in the Amazon or whatever, but somehow you got the feeling the loads were a lot heavier on the way back.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Now they also dropped guns off on the way down, so it's not totally, but they were stressed out to the max bringing back white stuff. So you see the God,
Yeah.
What is it? The Lord works in mysterious ways. Isn't that,
Yeah.
isn't that what they might say?
Yes, he sure does.
I think we could also spend a whole nother program talking about the killings of people who didn't go along with cover-ups, and touch on the different organizations like World Vision or whatever. It's like there's so much more that we could touch upon.
Well, I
More
think
than
we,
we have.
I think, Mac, I think we've taken up a lot of your time, and we're probably going to wear out the listeners here, so we can probably wrap it up now. But yeah, we actually could even have a discussion of like cults, for example. We could even have a panel at some time with a couple, 2 or 3 people who are knowledgeable, because I think if you really went into it deeply, you'd see these overlapping signs, like I'm mentioning in Japan, where it wasn't even really a Japanese thing. I mean, it was Japanese, maybe 40% or something, but there are great signs of foreign involvement. And then with the Waco situation, it just seems like there's so much to learn if we look into it. And that whole Jonestown, I mean, there's just so many of these things that at the time it's a turnoff because it's so weird, right? I mean, wrapping your mind around Branch
Well, the media,
Davidian philosophy.
and the media portrays it in such a way. It's not until later that you can connect all the dots.
Right. Unfortunately, though, now we have the internet, and so
Yeah.
Mac, you probably went to Waco. You know what I mean? You could talk to somebody who's there. You went there on the 1-year anniversary or whatever, and so
Yeah.
for those of us far away, we just aren't going to be willing to spend the money and time and whatever. And so now we can kind of compare notes, so to speak.
Yes, at the
And
time, as I was saying earlier, the internet was in its infancy, and so I go to Waco, uh, and the information that we were learning in the first few months. It was going to be a long time before the documentary got made. Plus, I was putting together a piece of comics journalism to be published in the Nose magazine. It was going to wait months before that could be published. And again, if you're talking a documentary that was being released on a VHS tape and a magazine article that was going to be, available only in print for a very limited audience compared to the huge audience, international audience that the internet shows. I mean, if we had had the internet when Kennedy was killed, it wouldn't have taken years for so much information to get out there. So that's made a big difference. Information travels fast, but then, so does disinformation.
well, that's the problem. Is now we're dealing with a different problem. Now we've got disinformation that's just overwhelming us. But still, all things considered, those of us who've been in the game for a while, it's a big win because a lot of the disinfo, I could probably write a computer script to just look for names and I know where the disinfo is,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's, in other words, it's like got all these patterns. It's like it's written by robots or something, It's
Yeah.
it's like straight out of Langley's you know, uh, automated intelligence unit. You know what I mean? It's so predictable in a sense once you've been at it a while. I mean, maybe if you're 20 years old, you can't see this as much, but those of us have been dealing with it, trying to analyze things. It's a big win. And going forward, don't want to drag things out too much, but I mean, we could make the case that lately there's been a big push for these school shootings, and and a lot of them, to me, just my opinion, and a lot of them look like they're more Hollywood than real. A lot of these things, not just the school shootings, but various events lately have had a real flavor of Hollywood special effects as opposed to actual dead bodies. Now, I'm not saying
Made
there are
for
no
TV.
right. I'm not saying there are no dead bodies at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that some of this looks like a PR campaign. It's like, well, it's Tuesday, so we need another, policeman gunned down by crazed, whatever they need that week, black Muslim or, white rural guy or, whatever it is they think they need, immigrant, you know what I mean? Something from central casting. And a lot of it doesn't look very real. But then, they, in Portland, Oregon, in the suburbs there in Beaverton, they had a case where a guy was going to pull out a gun and shoot some people, and an off-duty security guard was carrying a gun and stopped the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oops, I think we better not do real events so much anymore that
Yeah.
we can't control. In other words, if they're
Hmm.
doing something, I think they now might want to do it in places like, I don't know, in government buildings or schools where it's more under control, because they don't want off-duty guys pulling out guns and becoming heroes.
Yeah, they want this to fit their agenda. That's pretty apparent. And it does feel a lot of times like it's straight from central casting or made for TV. There were so many strange allegations and things that came out in the aftermath of Sandy Hook that they might have actually employed so-called crisis actors, which again, like you were saying, doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't people really killed, but that there's the strong suspicion that certain elements of these staged psyops or black ops are scripted and augmented by something that's less than real. It gets really murky and strange, and I mean, this is it's turned into a real rabbit hole. The
Yeah, and with
entire
today's
thing.
computers, that's another issue, is that graphics you can't trust and photos you
Hmm.
can't trust anymore. And so that's another element. Somebody can go on and say, this proves this, and no, it doesn't. It just proves that you've got a video of this,
Yeah.
you know, right? Somebody comes on the YouTube and posts something and says, this was on the local TV, but you don't know that it was. Maybe it was, and then they modified it, or
Hmm.
maybe the bad guys made the whole thing from scratch. I mean, we don't
Yeah.
really know. So it's a murky world, but nonetheless, the PR campaigns seem so scripted that you definitely have that feeling. But overall,
Hmm.
we're really making a lot of progress, which I think we talked about at different parts of this interview, that the compared to the rather barren ground we had in the, let's say, the 1970s, trying to get people to wake up. And I think I'll wrap it with a quote that came from Bobby Kennedy, more or less, and it was along the lines of, and this is after his brother was shot. He said, I came to realize that the America I live in is not the one that I thought I lived in, and that was part of his motivation for running for president. Um, he actually, like you said, had that priest-like idealism. And maybe that's how he was so reckless as to fight the mafia and everybody else. So, you know, we're helping to wake people up, and I think we're making a lot of progress. Anyway, thank you, Mack, for coming. We do appreciate it.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, you're
It's been our
welcome.
pleasure.
I have really enjoyed this.
A lot of good educational material. Mack, keep up the good work with the comics and all that. And that's it, folks. Thanks for coming. Take care. Bye-bye. It's a wrap.